She was the one they wouldn't look at. Not directly, not anymore. And Miriam Holt had learned to make herself small enough that looking became unnecessary. The Dominion Day supper at Calvary Lutheran in Hartwell, Saskatchewan had been running for 31 years without interruption. Miriam had attended every single one of them, first as a child wedged between her parents on the long pine bench, then as a young wife proud enough of her husband's pot roast to carry it 2 blocks in the cold. This year, she had almost not come at all, but the alternative was sitting alone in the house, where the curtains still smelled like him. So she put on her gray wool dress and walked the 2 blocks and pushed open the heavy door. The hall was exactly as it always was, the long folding tables draped in white cloth, the Kowalski women fussing over the bread rolls, Reverend Price shaking hands near the entrance with the satisfaction of a man who believed attendance was a personal tribute to himself. What was different was the silence that preceded Miriam as she crossed the room, not the silence of an empty space. The silence of people who have already said everything worth saying to one another and are now choosing to say nothing more to her. She took a seat at the far end of the last table. The chair beside her remained empty. So did the one across from her. 6 months ago, those seats would have been full. 6 months ago, her husband Gareth had been the man. Everyone in Hartwell wanted to stand beside at supper, because Gareth Holt laughed easily and bought the first round and always seemed to know the punchline before the joke was finished. 6 months ago, Gareth had disappeared along with $4,000 from the Hartwell Grain Cooperative's operating account. The official version, repeated so many times it had calcified into fact, was this: Gareth Holt, treasurer of the cooperative for 7 years, had embezzled the money in a scheme involving falsified invoices, then panicked when the annual audit approached and driven his truck into the frozen Capel River. His body had not been recovered. The water beneath the ice was deep and the current was cold, and the river gave nothing back. What Hartwell decided to recover instead was its sense of moral order, and the nearest available target was the woman who had shared his name. Miriam was 26 years old. She had $12.40 in a checking account that the cooperative's lawyer had already threatened to garnish. She had a drafty bungalow on the edge of town, with a furnace that rattled like something dying in the walls every time the temperature dropped below -15, which in January in Saskatchewan was most of the time. She had a job at the feed store that the owner, a man named Clifford Brecht, who had been Gareth's hunting partner for 15 years, had quietly terminated 2 weeks after the funeral that wasn't a funeral because there was no body to bury. She had, in other words, exactly nothing. And the people of Hartwell, who had known her since she was small enough to fall asleep under this same table while the adults drank coffee and talked about the harvest, had decided that was precisely what she deserved. Miriam folded her hands in her lap and looked at her plate. The baked beans were lukewarm. The slice of ham was the color of old copper. She ate anyway, methodically, because she had learned that the only way to endure a room full of people who have decided you are invisible is to become genuinely indifferent to their opinions. She was working on the indifference. It was slow going. The door at the far end of the hall opened. The sound was not dramatic. It was just a door opening. But something in the room changed. A frequency shift, like the moment before a storm when the birds go silent and the air pressure drops. Miriam looked up. The man standing in the entrance was not from Hartwell. That was immediately and completely obvious. He was tall in the way that certain men from the North Country are tall, built not for appearance but for function, with broad shoulders that came from actual work and hands that were visibly scarred even from a distance. He wore a canvas work jacket so faded it was almost colorless, and his dark hair was longer than Hartwell generally approved of. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. His face was the kind that weather had made its own. Miriam recognized him distantly. Theo Sark. He ran a trap line up near Candle Lake and came through Hartwell twice a year to sell his pelts and buy supplies. She had seen him twice before in her life, briefly, in the way you see someone pass a window. He had never spoken to her. She had never spoken to him. Theo Sark stood in the doorway of the church hall and surveyed the room the way a man surveys a landscape rather than a social gathering, looking for features, not faces. Then his gaze settled. on the empty chairs, on Miriam behind them. He walked the length of the hall. The crowd moved back from him in the subtle, instinctive way of people who are not individually afraid, but who collectively sense something large and unhurried moving through their space. He passed the Kowalski women. He passed Reverend Price, who began to say something about the trading hours at the cooperative office and then thought better of it. He walked to the last table at the far end of the room and stopped directly across from Miriam. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "Mind if I sit?" he said. His voice was quiet. It was not the careful quiet of someone managing an audience. It was the quiet of someone who spent most of their time in places where there was no one to speak to. Miriam, whose hands had been trembling slightly in her lap since he'd started walking toward her, made herself breathe. "There's no one stopping you," she said. He sat. He reached across the table for the bread basket that Phyllis Rempel had been hugging to her side of the table like a life preserver and set it between them. He helped himself without ceremony. "You shouldn't," Miriam said quietly, not looking at him. "Sit here, I mean. It won't do you any good with anyone in this room." Theo spread butter on his bread, with the focused attention of a man for whom butter and bread were a serious matter. "I come through here twice a year," he said, "not trying to do myself good with anyone." He took a bite. "I grew up on a reserve north of Prince Albert. I know what a room looks like when it's decided something about someone." He looked at her directly. "Pass the salt if you've got it." Miriam passed the salt. She had not finished a meal in this hall in 6 months, without the sensation of being slowly compressed under the weight of other people's certainty. That evening, for the first time, the weight lifted slightly, not because anything had changed, because the man sitting across from her had chosen not to acknowledge it, and in doing so had made it for 1 hour smaller than it was. He knew her name. She didn't learn this until the end of the meal, when he said simply, "Miriam," as she stood to go, and she turned and looked at him, and he said, "Winter's coming in hard. The river road out to your place floods bad when the melt comes in spring. You want to be somewhere solid before that happens." He paused. "I know things about that river." Miriam walked home in the dark and told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong. The next morning came in gray and salt bright, the kind of January morning that Saskatchewan specialized in. Sky the color of old tin. Snow that had frozen and refrozen until it had the consistency of ground glass underfoot. Miriam woke at 6 and dressed and went outside to deal with the wood situation, which had become genuinely urgent. The cord she'd bought in November was almost gone and she couldn't afford more. She came around the corner of the house and stopped. There was wood stacked against the entire south wall, a full cord, maybe more, split and piled with the tidy precision of someone who had been doing this for a long time. And hanging from the hook beside the back door, wrapped carefully in burlap, was a white-tailed deer, gutted and dressed, no less than 60 pounds of meat. Miriam stood in the snow and stared at it for a long moment. She heard boots on frozen ground. Theo came out of the tree line leading a saddled horse loaded with supply bags. He stopped when he saw her expression. "You didn't have to do this," Miriam said. "I know." He tied the horse to the fence post. "Coffee's better if it's offered, though." Miriam let him in. The kitchen was small. He made it smaller, not aggressively, but simply through the fact of him, the size of his shoulders in the doorway, the care with which he moved around the table, and the chairs rather than through them. She put the kettle on and watched him set his supply bags down and take a seat, and she thought about asking how he knew her name, and how he knew where she lived and why he had... And before she could say any of it, the sound of a truck coming up the driveway broke through the morning. Quiet. She knew the truck, dark blue, polished to a corporate shine even in January. It belonged to Dale Furtney, who was the Hartwell Grain Co-operative's general manager, who was the man who had signed Gareth's termination letter 6 months ago, who was also, incidentally, the man who had told the RCMP that the missing $4,000 had been Gareth's idea, and Gareth's alone, and whose testimony had ensured that no further investigation was considered necessary. Miriam stepped outside before he could knock. Furtney was a man of 50 or so who had learned to wear the face of patience like a mask over something less patient. He was flanked by his assistant, a nervous young man named Perry, who never quite made eye contact with anyone. Fertney smiled at Miriam the way you smile at someone you are doing a favor by speaking to. Morning, Miriam. Cold enough for you? He looked at the stacked wood against the house. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I heard you had a visitor last night at the supper. The church supper is a public event, Miriam said. Sure it is. Fertney stepped forward, resting one foot on the bottom porch step in a way that was not quite asking permission. Listen, I want you to know that the board has been going over your situation and we genuinely feel, Miriam, that there may be options available. A repayment arrangement. Something quiet, that keeps you in the community. You understand. He let that sit for a moment. But that depends on your cooperation, Dove. And it depends on you not going around making the co-op look like the problem by keeping company with people from outside who ask a lot of questions. He paused meaningfully. There were some questions being asked up at the river last month. Trappers asking around about the ice conditions out near Miller Crossing the day Gareth's truck went in. I want that to stop. Miriam went very still. Who was asking, she said. Don't matter who. It needs to stop. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 6 months, with the quiet, settled authority of a man who knew where all the levers were. I can make the garnishment go forward by end of February, or I can make it disappear. Entirely your choice how this goes, Miriam. She didn't invite you onto her porch, friend. Theo's voice came from the doorway behind Miriam. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee. He held one out to Miriam and kept the other for himself, and leaned against the doorframe with the unhurried ease of someone who had not yet had occasion to be genuinely inconvenienced by this conversation. Fertney turned. Something moved across his face, a recalibration. Mr. Sark. You're a long way from Candle Lake. I go where I have business, Theo said pleasantly. You were talking about the ice at Miller Crossing. I know those ice conditions better than most. I'm out on that stretch 4 or 5 times a winter. He sipped his coffee, had occasion to look at it pretty carefully last month, after the melt started on the south bank and took a section of the snowpack down to last spring's freeze. He let that sentence complete itself. Fertney's face was not doing what he wanted it to do. I don't know what you think you found. I haven't said I found anything, Theo said. I said I had occasion to look. He met Fertney's eyes and held them. You should finish your coffee somewhere else. I think Miriam's had enough company for one morning. Fertney left. He didn't speak again. He got in the truck, and he and Perry drove back down the road, and the sound of the engine faded into the flat Saskatchewan cold, and Miriam turned and looked at Theo Sark standing in her doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, and felt something open in her chest that might have been hope or might have been terror. She wasn't yet sure. You need to tell me, she said. Whatever you found, you need to tell me right now. Theo set his mug down on the porch railing. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small cloth bundle and set it in her hands. She unwrapped it. It was a piece of metal, misshapen, flattened on one side, roughly the diameter of a large caliber rifle round. I found that embedded in a spruce at the south edge of the Miller Crossing bank, Theo said quietly, 10 feet above the waterline. The entry angle was wrong for a hunting shot. It came from the road, not the tree line. And there was glass on the ice below it. Not windshield glass. Headlight glass. He looked at her. Gareth's truck didn't go through the ice on its own, Miriam. Someone ran him off the road. And whoever did it had the kind of influence to make sure the RCMP looked at the hole in the ice and not at the bank. The world did a slow, sideways rotation. She had known, in the way that you know things that you cannot prove, and therefore cannot let yourself fully think, that Gareth had not stolen anything. He had been meticulous about money, in the way that people who grew up without it often are. Every receipt filed, every entry double-checked, every balance reconciled before he'd let himself sleep. He had been working on something in the weeks before he disappeared. She had seen him at the kitchen table late at night with the cooperative's ledger open and his handwriting filling the margins in the small, careful script he used when he was working through something serious. The ledger had never been recovered. There's more, Theo said. He reached into his jacket again and removed a folded piece of paper. It was water-stained, the edges eaten by freeze and thaw cycles, but the paper itself was thick. The kind of ledger paper that was made to last. Miriam's hands shook as she unfolded it. She recognized Gareth's handwriting immediately. It filled the right side of the page in those same careful margins she had watched him write in 100 times at the kitchen table. The entry at the top was dated the 12th of October, 2 weeks before he disappeared. Discrepancy confirmed. October audit. $4,000 transferred in 3 transactions, falsified vendor invoices, payee accounts held by D. Furtney, W. Carsley, and then lower in the hurried scrawl of someone writing quickly. If something happens, this page is in the hollow of the river birch, south bank, 4th tree from the crossing. Miriam's legs stopped working correctly. She sat down on the porch step without deciding to. W. Carsley. Walter Carsley was the RCMP staff sergeant who had overseen the investigation into Gareth's disappearance. Who had stood in Miriam's kitchen in his brown uniform and told her, with the measured sympathy of a man delivering a verdict, that all evidence pointed to her husband's guilt. "They killed him," Miriam said. The words sounded strange out loud, like saying something in a language she'd only ever read. Furtney and Carsley. They stole the money and Gareth found out and they killed him and made it look like he ran. That's what the evidence says. Theo crouched down beside her on the step. His voice was steady in the way that things which have roots tend to be. "Furtney knows I've been looking at that crossing. He knew before he drove up here this morning. That's what the garnishment threat was. It was a message. He's going to escalate, Miriam, now that he's seen me here. Carsley controls the local detachment. We can't use local channels. Then what do? There's an RCMP superintendent in Regina who runs the commercial crime unit. Her name is Inspector Brenda Whitehorse. I know people who know her. She's been looking for a reason to pull the Hartwell detachment's files for 2 years. He looked at the ledger page in Miriam's hands. That's her reason. Regina is 5 hours in good weather, Miriam said. And Furtney knows you're here. How long before Carsley shows up? Theo was already standing. Not long. We need to leave before noon. Miriam went inside. She moved through the house that had been both her cage and her anchor for 6 months, and she gathered the things that mattered. Her father's watch, Gareth's extra set of truck keys, the manila envelope she kept at the back of the linen closet, where she had been silently collecting every strange thing she'd noticed in the weeks before Gareth vanished. 3 invoices she'd found in his jacket pocket with vendors she'd never heard of, a phone number written on a paper napkin in someone else's handwriting. Small things that had not yet been evidence of anything. They were evidence now. She was back on the porch in 12 minutes. They took Theo's truck, an old half-ton that had been repaired so many times it had become a different vehicle entirely, and they were on the highway heading south before the sun cleared the horizon. The fields spread out on either side of the road in flat, white, absolute silence, the kind of landscape that had nothing to hide and nowhere to hide it. They were 90 kilometers out of Hartwell when Theo's mirrors lit up with the flash of pursuit lights. It was not an RCMP cruiser. It was a dark blue truck, polished to a corporate shine even in January, and it was moving fast. "Furtney," Miriam said. "He's got someone with him." Theo watched the mirrors without changing his speed. 2 shapes in the cab. Perry wouldn't do this alone. His jaw tightened. "There's a grid road 10 kilometers ahead. I know where it goes." He took the grid road at speed, the half-ton fish-tailing slightly on the packed snow before the tires found their grip, and Furtney's truck followed, and for 3 kilometers they moved through the flat silence of the prairie in a chase that looked nothing like the ones in films. No sharp turns. No dramatic drops, just 2 vehicles moving fast through a white landscape, with no witnesses for 30 kilometers in any direction. Theo turned sharply off the grid road and into a farm lane and cut the engine. Furtney's truck shot past on the grid road, brake lights flaring red in the gray morning, skidding on the snow as it stopped 100 meters ahead. Both doors opened. Furtney got out first. The second figure was not Perry, it was Walter Carsley, not in uniform, in a dark jacket with his hands at his sides and the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had decided something. Theo got out of the truck. He told Miriam to stay inside. She did not stay inside. She got out and stood in the snow and looked at the 2 men walking toward them across the frozen field and thought about Gareth at the kitchen table at midnight, with the ledger open and his pen moving in those careful margins. And something inside her that had been slowly collapsing for 6 months became suddenly structural again. a wall going up where rubble had been. "That's far enough," she called out. Her voice carried clearly in the cold air. Both men stopped. "I know you have the ledger page," Furtney said. His voice was still doing its patience trick, but the patience was thinner now, stretched over something that was working hard to get through. "Miriam, this doesn't have to be complicated. Nobody wants to see you hurt. We just need—" "You want to tell me what you need?" Miriam said. "You already told me, in my own yard this morning. A repayment arrangement. Quiet. Cooperative." She let those words sit in the cold air for a moment. "You told my husband the same thing, didn't you? He found the discrepancy and you went to him first, offered him the same deal. And when he said no—" "Careful," Carsley said. It was the first word he'd spoken. His voice was professional in the way that a blade is professional. "When he said no," Miriam continued, "you followed him out to Miller Crossing and you ran his truck off the road. And you stood on that bank in the dark and you watched him go through the ice. And then you drove back to town and put on your uniform and told me to my face that my husband was a thief." Her voice did not break. She had not known until this moment that it wouldn't, but it didn't. "I have his handwriting on a piece of cooperative ledger paper naming both of you. I have a bullet pulled from a spruce tree above the waterline at Miller Crossing. And I have a phone that has been sending photographs of both of those things to a number in Regina every 20 minutes since we left Hartwell." She held up her phone. The auto-send function she had set up in the truck. Theo's quiet suggestion when he'd handed her his portable charger 40 kilometers back and told her to make sure someone else had copies of everything. Carsley looked at Furtney. Something passed between them. The specific something that passes between two people who have been calculating together for a long time and have just arrived at the same calculation simultaneously and don't like the answer. Carsley took a step forward. Theo moved between them. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in the snow with the flat, unmovable quality of the landscape behind him, and something about the way he occupied the space made Carsley stop. "There's no version of this that ends the way you want it to," Theo said quietly. "Not anymore. The only question is whether you walk away from it or whether you make it worse." The silence was very long. Furtney moved first. He walked back to the truck. He got in after a moment. Carsley followed him. The blue truck reversed down the farm lane and turned onto the grid road and drove away. Miriam exhaled a breath she had been holding, it felt, for 6 months. They reached Regina by mid-afternoon. Inspector Whitehorse was not an easy woman to read. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away during the giving of information and then asked very precise questions afterward. She asked 14 of them. She examined the ledger page under a light for a long time. She looked at the deformed bullet. She read twice the photographs Miriam had sent to the number in Regina, which turned out to be Theo's cousin, who had been instructed to forward everything to a lawyer if anything went wrong. At the end of it, she looked at Miriam directly and said, "You should have come to us sooner." "I didn't know there was anything to come to you with," Miriam said. "And the man I would have asked about it was wearing the uniform." Inspector Whitehorse held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and reached for her phone. 3 weeks later, Dale Furtney was arrested at the cooperative's office in Hartwell. He was sitting at his desk eating lunch when the commercial crime unit came through the door, and the thing Miriam heard later, from Phyllis Rempel, who heard it from her son who worked at the municipal office, was that Furtney had simply looked at the door and put down his fork and said nothing at all. Walter Carsley was arrested the same morning at his home. He had already resigned from the RCMP the previous week, for reasons he had described in his letter as personal. The cooperative's stolen money was found in a numbered account in Furtney's wife's name. A second amount, nearly $6,000, was found in a separate account that turned out to belong to a numbered company that Carsley had registered under a family member's address. The full amount was eventually returned to the cooperative. Gareth Holt's name was cleared in a formal statement issued by the RCMP's K Division in Regina. The statement was printed in the Hartwell Weekly under the headline "Local Man Exonerated," and Miriam read it at a kitchen table that was no longer her kitchen table, because the house on the edge of town was already rented to someone else. The people of Hartwell made several attempts, in the weeks that followed, to reach Miriam with casseroles and apologies, and the specific kind of warmth that communities extend when they are trying to reassure themselves. They drove out the highway and knocked at the door and found no one home. Candle Lake was 3 hours north of Hartwell. The ice on it held until May, and the fishing after that was better than anything in the south. The nearest town was 40 minutes on a good road, 90 on a logging road in mud season, and the people in it minded their own business with a thoroughness that Miriam had come to understand was not unfriendliness but respect. She had learned, over a winter of gradual and unhurried conversations in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and black tea, that Theo Sark had grown up with a father who believed that silence was the most honest form of speech, and a mother who had disagreed with this and was usually right, and that he had spent 10 years in the North Country, not because he was hiding from anything, but because he had found, in the honest company of rivers and tree lines and hard, cold seasons, a kind of clarity that the company of certain people tended to obscure. She had learned that she agreed with him. She sat on the porch in early June with her tea going cold in her hands, watching the light come off the lake in that long, flat gold way that northern evenings have of, and she thought about the woman who had sat at the end of a table in a church hall and pushed baked beans around a plate, while 60 people she had known all her life looked past her, and she felt a distance from that woman that was not indifference. It was perspective. It was what remained when the weight that other people had placed on you was finally, fully set down. Theo came out of the tree line at the far edge of the property, leading the canoe up from the water. He raised one hand. She raised hers back. She was not the Hartwell co-operative widow anymore. She was not the woman the town had decided about. She was a person sitting on a porch on a lake in early June with a cup of cold tea, watching someone she trusted come home. That was more than enough.